Hello, boys and girls. We are ready for Chapter 9 in our book, The Monsters of Morley Manor. This one is called Water Guys. And the picture you're looking at is one that I actually own. It's a painting by Paul Dedelson. I kind of like this Americana style. So, anyways, Chapter 9. The creature that stood dripping at the edge of the water was about 4 feet high. Even though it had arms and walked upright, it looked sort of like a cross between a frog and a fish. A spiny crest ran from its head to its butt. Huge, goggling eyes were set above a mouth so wide that I figured if the thing yawned, the top of his head would fall off. It had gills, but no scales. Its skin, which glistened in the sunlight, looked like mottled purple leather with a light coating of slime. I probably should have been more scared than I was. Maybe what kept me from totally wiggling out is the fact that I like frogs so much. We have a lot of them around Owl's Roost, and I like to catch them and hypnotize them. It's a trick I learned from a library book. If you turn a frog upside down and slowly rub your fingers from its throat down along its belly over and over again, pretty soon it will get totally calm and just lie there in your hand, unable to move. It's really cool, but you have to be very gentle when you do it. The water guy held up a webbed hand and then made a series of croaks that sounded like a whole frog orchestra. Everything from the tiny trills of spring peepers to something like the rumble of a bullfrog, only much, much deeper. The Wentar put his hands on the side of his own neck for a moment and then made a series of similar sounds. Given the fact that I can barely pass my French tests, I found this very impressive. The water guy responded with another froggy chorus. "What did he say?" Gaspar asked. "His name is Chug-Rug-Lala Aspalala Rugamum Bump Bump," replied the Wentar, the words coming from deep in his throat. "But you can call him Chuck." "Well, that's a relief," said Albert. The Wentar glared at him. "Chuck welcomes us as long as we guarantee that we come in peace." "A welcome is all very nice," said Gaspar impatiently. "The question is, will he help this band of poor lost wanderers?" "Well, that is the question I'm trying to find out," snapped the Wentar. "Perhaps if you would stop interrupting me, I would be able to get an answer." Gaspar clamped his mouth shut and demonstrated what a lizard looks like when it feels both embarrassed and angry. The Wentar and the water guy talked for another minute or so, sounding like a chorus of swamp creatures on a warm spring night. Finally, the Wentar turned to the rest of us and said, "Lie on your backs." Gaspar looked suspicious. "For what reason?" The Wentar sighed. "I have to do something, and it will be easier if you're all lying down, preferably in a circle with your heads at the center." Gaspar tightened his jaws, then nodded twice, once at the Wentar and once at the rest of us, indicating that we should do as he said. It took a while. Albert couldn't get comfortable because of his hump, and Bob whined and growled, causing Gaspar to admit that they had never managed to train him very well. For me, the worst of it was the snakes on Melisandre's head, which wouldn't hold still. I had just settled into my spot when one of them came slithering across my neck, causing me to scream and leap to my feet. "What now?" the Wentar asked angrily. "A snake!" I gasped, clutching my neck. "It was crawling over me." Melisandre looked offended, and her snakes all hissed. "He wasn't going to hurt you. He was just checking you out." Gaspar's tongue, long as a snake itself, flicked in and out of his mouth. "Lie back down," he ordered. "Melisandre, keep your boys under control." She glared at him but nodded. "Glad it wasn't me," whispered Sarah when I was on my back again. "Well, I wish it had been," I said. That was the only partly true. I actually kind of like snakes. Sarah hates them. And if one of them had crawled on her neck, it might have taken hours for us to get her settled down again. The Wentar began to walk around us, muttering in a low voice. He took something from a leather pouch at his side and sprinkled it over our heads. Then Chug-Rug-Lala-Aspa-Lala-Rugum Bump-Bump splashed water on us. "Hold still," the Wentar said when we started to sit up, and he said it so sharply that even Bob obeyed. Then he began to sing in a low voice, gesturing over us as he did. I felt a weird tingle creep across my skin. After about 5 minutes, the Wentar said, "Now you can sit up." What was that all about? I muttered. Though I was speaking to myself, Chuck answered me. "We were arranging things so you could communicate with us more easily." Actually, what he said was a whole series of croaks and peeps, but I understood them perfectly. "Wow, how did that happen?" asked Sarah. She sounded as astonished as I felt. She also sounded just like Chuck. I don't mean she had his voice, just that the sounds she was making were in his language. I stared at her in amazement. "We cast a spell on you, of course," said the Wentar. I had always figured aliens would be super scientific. I was having a hard time getting used to the idea of them as magic users. "Follow me," said the water guy, heading for the edge of the lake. I want you to meet my mother." "She doesn't mind having strangers just drop by?" I asked nervously. "Does she live underwater?" Sarah asked, sounding even more nervous. "Don't worry," said Chuck. "You'll be able to breathe. We took care of that too." He squatted, then sprang forward, not even looking to see if we were going to follow him. The jump carried him a good 30 feet straight out. He landed with a large splash and then disappeared beneath the surface. The Wentar waded in after him. Bob followed close at his heels, but I suspect that was mostly because he liked the water. Though he still was his semi-human form, he barked exuberantly as he bounded through the rippling waves. Suddenly, he plunged in over his head as if he had just gone past a drop-off. He came up at once, splashing and spluttering, and then disappeared again. This time, he didn't come back. "Maybe must be the breathing thing works," said Sarah. "Either that or someone ate him," answered Albert. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," snapped Gaspar, squaring his shoulders. He waded into the water after Bob and the Wentar and Chuck. "Come along, Albert," he said without looking back. "Destiny awaits." "Whatever you say, boss," said Albert. He glanced back at me and Sarah, rolled his eyes, spread his hands in what you can call in a what can you do kind of gesture, and then turned and followed Gaspar into the water. That left Ludmilla, Melisande, Sarah, and me standing on the shore. "What about my hair?" muttered Melisande. It wasn't the kind of girl question it sounded like, since her snakes were twisting and writhing around her head in great alarm. Even so, it did make me realize that it was just me and the girls on the beach, so I stepped in. "Anthony, wait!" Sarah cried. She came splashing after me. The water was cold and had an odd lemony smell. The smell was actually kind of pleasant. It was just weird. It was also weird to go in with my clothes on, though the legs of my jeans were already damp from the walk to Morley Manor. Now they clung tightly to my skin. Feeling cold and heavy, I was glad I hadn't put anything important in my pockets before we left home. As we moved deeper into the lake, I heard Melisande and Ludmilla wade in behind us, grumbling and hissing as they did. I figured they were even unhappier about getting their clothes wet than I was, but I didn't look back. I was busy peering into the water around me, worrying about everything from man-eating plants to a giant slime fish to living mud. Given the creature we had already met, who knew what sorts of things might live in the lake of this planet? Suddenly Gaspar stuck his head above the water surface, water streaming off his long snout. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he shouted. "Hurry up!" That was a good sign. In fact, the fact that we had not seen any of the others who had gone under had me worried. Turning to Sarah, I said, "Ready?" She nodded. Joining hands, we waded forward. Since she was shorter, her head went under first, and I stood and watched. Okay, I know how that makes me sound really rotten, but I figured if there was a problem, it would be easier for me to haul her out than vice versa. A second later, she stuck her head up and called, "Harry, Anthony, this is really neat." Then I was annoyed because I hadn't gone under first. I plunged in after her, trying to hold my breath, but I quickly realized that couldn't last for long. Besides, the point was to breathe the water, causing cautiously, very cautiously. I let some of it trickle in through my nose. Utterly cool. Instead of choking and burning, the water felt good in my lungs. Feeling bolder, I drew in a deep breath, filling my lungs with lemony water. It was heavy in my chest, but not uncomfortable. I looked around. The Wentar's spell must have done something to our eyes as well as our lungs, because I could see perfectly. Strange fish-like creatures swam all around us. Some of them were transparent, like ghost fish. Others had big goggly eyes, or fins that trailed behind them like ribbons. Ahead of us, weird plants stretched toward the surface, bending back and forth like ghostly, grasping hands. A variety of brilliantly colored flowers, some as small as thimbles, some as big as dinner plates, bloomed on the bottom. Boy, I bet Mom and Dad would love some of those for the shop, I thought. Then I spotted Gaspar. He looked impatient. Come on, I said to Sarah, we better hurry. I half expected the words to come out in little bubbles. Duh. You have to have air to make bubbles, and we weren't breathing air anymore, so the words just came out as sound, made odd by the fact that they were traveling through water rather than air. I glanced over my shoulder. The lake bed sloped up behind us. Ludmilla and Melisande were completely underwater now, too, and Melisande's snakes were writhing wildly about her head. I hoped the snakes were all right. I thought about going back to check, but I figured Melisande would know if anything was wrong. Even as I watched, they began to settle down. Since Melisande didn't turn and head for the surface, I figured they were relaxing and not drowning. I glanced up. The sun, catching on the water that rippled overhead, made the surface look like some kind of silvery ceiling, with a pattern that changed from moment to moment. I tapped Sarah's shoulder and pointed up for her to look. She smiled and then said happily, This is the weirdest, coolest thing that's ever happened to us, Anthony. I didn't know if she meant breathing underwater or everything that had gone on since we first put Albert in the sink. Either way, she was right. Melisande and Ludmilla caught up with us by that time. We'd better keep moving, said Ludmilla. We started out again. The lake bed was getting kind of mucky, and some clinging weeds made it hard to walk, so we began to swim, which turned out to be a lot easier. Though we could breathe, the water was still wet, of course, so our hair was floating around our heads while our clothes were plastered to our bodies. Not that Melisande's dress had been pretty much plastered to her own body already. Sarah caught me looking at her now and gave me an elbow to the ribs. As we swam deeper, I felt the pressure of the water begin to squeeze me. I wondered how far down we were going to go and whether the Wentar spell would protect us from being squished by the water's great weight. I gazed around, fascinated by the fish and the scenery, not paying much attention to where we were heading, when suddenly Sarah cried, Holy mackerel! At first I thought she had seen a giant fish, and then I realized that the water guy had led us over a cliff. I was terrified when I saw that dark drop beneath us, but really, it was no big deal. When you're already in the water and you're not going to fall or anything. As my terror began to ebb, I studied the strange landscape below us, and then I saw what Sarah had been shouting about. It wasn't a cliff after all. My heart began to pound again, and I wondered if we had been betrayed. And that's the end of the chapter, boys and girls. So until next time.